Hey, David Brewster here with another episode of Breaking Chords, and this is Diminished Arpeggios. And I know this area of chords and arpeggios was very confusing for me initially. Because you have diminished chords, diminished arpeggios, you have diminished seventh chords, and diminished seventh arpeggios, and then you also have minor 7 flat 5, which is half diminished. And those three flavors kind of eluded me for a while because I didn't understand, really what that meant. But really we have, a 3-note diminished chord or arpeggio, a triad. Diminished seventh chords and arpeggios are basically 4-note chords and arpeggios. And then minor 7 flat 5, which is also known as half diminished, is just a slight modification there. So we're going to unlock, some of the differences between that, but we're mainly going to stick with diminished seventh arpeggios because they're very common, and I know there's a lot of interesting things you can do with this. So here we go. Before we go, anywhere, we need to basically talk about what diminished means. So the best way I think to kind of tap into this or understand it is just think of a minor chord. All right, we're just going to be in the key of A minor. The whole lesson is going to be pretty much, A diminished and related to, the key of A. But if we think of just a stock A minor, open position chord, all right, there's a root, there's a minor third, and a fifth. So all we're going to do is we're going to change the fifth to a flat fifth. So we'll have root, flat 3, flat 5, which, looks like this. Okay, that very telltale kind of distinct, flavor and tonality. Very oddball, oddball sound at first, but then once you kind of get used to it, there's a lot of really cool things you can do with diminished scales, arpeggios, and of course chords too. So that's diminished, like A diminished. So to create a diminished seventh chord, like A diminished 7, we're going to basically add this G flat right here. So that's going to be the 2nd fret on the high E string. Now, a lot of people, they associate that with like old silent films, like when the bad guy would, basically tie the damsel, to the train tracks, and then you would hear this, distress, very suspenseful, very, you can hear that in Bugs Bunny cartoons and a bunch of stuff. Okay, so the first eye-opening thing here with this chord is, if you take that shape, A diminished 7, and move it up in minor thirds, there's a really interesting thing that happens. And, in scales and tails and a few other, lessons and material that I've posted, we've run into this. But with diminished, it really is kind of a mathematical, kind of anomaly, I guess, in music, because right there, we have E flat, A, C, and G flat. So if we move that up, 3 frets higher, now we have G flat, C, E flat, and A. It's the same 4 notes, they're just in a different order. Move it up again, and now we magically have A, E flat, G flat, and C. Move it up again, and we've got C, G flat, A, and E flat. And then we'll move it up again, and we're basically an octave higher than where we started. But right there, we're using the same 4 notes. They're just getting kind of mixed up and spelled differently, as we move that chord around the fretboard. So that happens with chords, but then that also happens with arpeggios too. So that's important, to remember and realize. Diminished arpeggios and chords are built on minor thirds. If we just lock into one string, and just basically go up in minor thirds or 3 frets at a time, you'll hear, a diminished tonality. And there was A, C, E flat, G flat, and A again. And of course, you can keep going higher too. But that's just kind of, showing you what we're actually playing with. Now, if you look at those chords that we just tapped into, there's actually an arpeggio fingering that's really common, and it lives right here. A little arpeggio fingering right there. It's the same thing as doing this, right? But instead of doing it on one string, there's this little, fingering shape we can tap into right there. So if we take that arpeggio fingering and move it up, 3 frets at a time, just like we did with the chord, that's going to reveal what I call Yngwie's highway, which Yngwie Malmsteen does this all the time. And, you're basically just grabbing that arpeggio and then go up 3 frets and do the same thing again. And then do it again. Do it again. And if you go up again, it's basically an octave higher than where we started right there. Now there's a really cool sequence or variation of that we can do where I'm going to ascend one shape, shift up 3 frets, and then descend that shape. Shift up 3 frets and ascend, shift up 3 frets and descend, and then shift up 3 frets and end it. That looks like this. And you can see right there we're just kind of weaving, between those different patterns. And it's actually a really good shape for your pinky too, because you're leading with the index and you're also leading with the pinky, as it alternates. So right there we just uncovered a really useful, diminished arpeggio. But we can move, along the lower string groups and find other shapes. There's another shape here starting on the B string. And then another shape starting on the G string. And then another shape on the D. So you can see the lower fingerings aren't as streamlined and easy to grab because you have to kind of, move between multiple positions there. So it is a lot easier, based off the high E string and then also the shape on the B string too. If we take that, that second shape that we found right here, that would still function as A diminished or A diminished 7. So we could move that all the way down here. And basically play it just like we did the Malmsteen shape. So that's kind of eye-opening. I think a lot of people are familiar with this shape, and maybe not as many people are familiar with that shape. But it's kind of cool to mix between those two. Do something like that. You can actually combine all those shapes. Okay, the last little tidbit here I'm going to add is going to modify that diminished 7th to a minor 7 flat 5. So as far as the chords are concerned, we're just going to alter that ever so slightly because now we basically want to add G instead of that G flat to the mix. So that's a very common fingering for it right there. You can also play it, some different ways here on the fretboard. But that's a very common, sound, especially in jazz and fusion music. And to some of you, you might be looking at that like a part of a 9th chord. You can think of that like an F9. But, remember that the A is our root. So if we think of A, then that becomes, A minor 7 flat 5. What that basically means, if we go back, to the original arpeggio we discovered right here, if we change G flat to G natural, then we're going to change that arpeggio to A minor 7 flat 5, and that would look like this. A slight modification to the sound. And I really like the way that sounds. So if we, basically maintain, that shifting idea, we can tap into, minor 7 flat 5 arpeggios like this. Now, I really like that arpeggio fingering because it forces you to use all of your fret hand fingers. And anytime I stumble onto a scale exercise or an arpeggio or a chord where I'm using all 4 fingers, I get excited because then I know I'm actually exercising and using you know, all of my fret hand digits, which is extremely important. Now, if you really want to twist your fingers around, you can apply, you know, the diminished seventh sequence we had where we were alternating, you know, between the index and pinky finger, and you can apply that to these minor 7 flat 5 arpeggios. But keep in mind, when we move this, it kind of breaks the spell of that diminished, you know, mystery on the fretboard, because now when we shift it, when you go up 3 frets, now you're playing C minor 7 flat 5. And then you're playing E flat and G flat. And then back to A. So that one note, you know, being altered kind of, like I said, kind of broke the spell of those diminished arpeggios. But it's still a really interesting, you know, arpeggio fingering, and that's a great exercise on the fretboard too. You know, really good exercise for sure. Now, there are a lot of variations and different versions of this you can discover on the guitar. Another variation, we could basically force, you know, the index finger to do all the shifting, and we can ascend and descend through that arpeggio like this. You know, and it's a really cool sequence, and it's just changing, you know, the order of the notes around slightly. That's going to wrap this look at diminished arpeggios, and, you know, leave some comments and some feedback. Let me know if you have any luck with this material, and I'll be back with some more lessons and content very soon. Thank you.